Hi Emerald class, I hope you're doing really well. It's been great looking at all of your learning and seeing everything that you guys have been up to while we've been stuck in lockdown and while you guys have had your Easter break as well. I've decided to pick a book that I'm going to be reading to you guys, and I'll be uploading a new chapter of me reading this book every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. And the book that I've chosen is one of my absolute favourite children's books that I enjoyed when I was young, and I hope that you might enjoy it too. And it's actually a few books in one, but it's The Complete Borrowers by Mary Norton. So today I'm going to read chapter 1. It was Mrs. May who first told me about them. No, not me. How could it have been me, a wild, untidy, self-willed little girl who stared with angry eyes and was said to crunch her teeth? Kate, she should have been called. Yes, that was it, Kate. Not that the name matters much either way. She barely comes into the story. Mrs. May lived in 2 rooms in Kate's parents' house in London. She was, I think, some kind of relation. Her bedroom was on the first floor, and her sitting room was a room which, as part of the house, was called the breakfast room. Now, breakfast rooms are all right in the morning when the sun streams in on the toast and marmalade, but by afternoon they seem to vanish a little and to fill with a strange silvery light, their own twilight. There's a kind of sadness in them then, but just as a child it was a sadness Kate liked. She would creep in to Mrs. May just before tea time, and Mrs. May would teach her to crochet. Mrs. May was old. Her joints were stiff, and she was not strict exactly, but she had that inner certainty which does instead. Kate was never wild with Mrs. May, nor untidy, nor self-willed, and Mrs. May taught her many things besides crochet. How to wind wool into an egg-shaped ball, how to run and fell and plan a darn, how to tidy a drawer and to lay like a blessing above the contents a sheet of rustling tissue against the dust. "Why so quiet, child?" asked Mrs. May one day when Kate was sitting hunched and idle upon the hassock. "What's the matter with you? Have you lost your tongue?" "No," said Kate, pulling at her shoe button. "I've lost the crochet hook." They were making a bed quilt in woolen squares. There were 30 still to do. "I know where I put it," she went on hastily. "I put it on the bedroom shelf of the bookcase just beside my bed." "On the bottom shelf?" repeated Mrs. May, her own needle flicking steady in the firelight. "Near the floor?" "Yes," said Kate, "but I looked on the floor, under the rug, everywhere. Wool was still there, though, just where I'd left it." "Oh dear," claimed Mrs. May lightly. "Don't say they're in this house too." "That what are?" asked Kate. "The borrowers," said Mrs. May, and in the half-light she seemed to smile. Kate stared a little fearfully. "Are there such things?" she asked after a moment. "As what?" Kate blinked her eyelids. "As people. Other people living in a house who borrow things." Mrs. May laid down her work. "What do you think?" she asked. "I don't know," said Kate, looking away and pulling hard at her shoe button. "There can't be, and yet—" She raised her head. "And yet sometimes I think there must be." "Why do you think there must be?" asked Mrs. May. "Well, because of all the things that disappear. Safety pins, for instance. Factories go on making safety pins, and every day people go on buying safety pins, and yet somehow there never is a safety pin just when you want one. Where are they all? Now, at this minute, where do they go to? Take needles," she went on. "All the needles my mother ever bought, there must be hundreds, can't just be lying about this house." Not lying about the house, no, agreed Mrs. May. And all the other things we keep on buying, again and again and again, like pencils and matchboxes and sealing wax and hair slides and drawing pins and thimbles. And hat pins, put in Mrs. May, and blotting paper. Yes, blotting paper, agreed Kate, but not hat pins. That's where you're wrong, said Mrs. May, and she picked up her work again. There was a reason for hat pins. Kate stared. A reason? She repeated. I mean, well, what kind of a reason? Well, there were two reasons, really. A hat pin is a very useful weapon, and Mrs. May laughed suddenly. But it all sounds such nonsense, and it was so very long ago. But tell me, said Kate, tell me how you know about the hat pin. Did you ever see one? Mrs. May threw her a startled glance. Well, yes, she began. Not a hat pin, exclaimed Kate impatiently. Whatever you called them, a borrower. Mrs. May drew a sharp breath. No, she said quickly. No, I never saw one. But someone else saw one, cried Kate, and you know about it. I can see you do. Hush, said Mrs. May. No need to shout. She gazed downwards at the upturned face, and then she smiled, and her eyes slid away into a distance. I had a brother, she began uncertainly. Kate knelt upon the hassock, and he saw them. I don't know, said Mrs. May, shaking her head. I just don't know. She smoothed out her work upon her knee. He was such a tease. He told us so many things, my sister and me. Impossible things. He was killed, she added gently, many years ago now on the northwest frontier. He became colonel of his regiment. He died what they call a hero's death. Was he your only brother? Yes. And he was our little brother. I think that's why... She thought for a moment, still smiling to herself. Yes, why he told us such impossible stories, such strange imaginings. He was jealous, I think, because we were older, and because we could read better. He wanted to impress us. He wanted, perhaps, to shock us. And yet... She looked into the fire. There was something about him. Perhaps because we were brought up in India among mystery, magic and legend. Something that made us think he saw things that other people could not see. Sometimes we'd know he was teasing, but at other times, we were not so sure. She leaned forward and in her tidy way brushed a fan of loose ashes under the grate. Then, brush in hand, she stared again at the fire. He wasn't a very strong little boy. The first time he came home from India, he got rheumatic fever. He missed a whole term at school and was sent away to the country to get over it, to the house of a great aunt. Later I went there myself. Oh, it was a strange old house. She hung up the brush on its brass hook and, dusting her hands on her handkerchief, she picked up her work. Better light the lamp, she said. Not yet, begged Kate, leaning forward. Please go on, please tell me. But I've told you. No, you haven't. This old house. Wasn't that where he saw... Mrs. May laughed. Where he saw the borrowers. Yes, that's what he told us. What he'd have us believe. And what's more, it seems that he didn't just see them, but he got to know them very well. He became a part of their lives, as it were. In fact, you might almost say that he became a borrower himself. Oh, do tell me, please. Try to remember right from the very beginning. But I do remember," said Mrs. May. "Oddly enough, I remember it better than many real things which have happened." Perhaps it was a real thing. I just don't know. You see, on the way back to India, my brother and I had to share a cabin. My sister used to sleep with our governess. And on those very hot nights, often we couldn't sleep, and my brother would talk for hours and hours, going over old ground, repeating conversations, telling me details again and again, wondering how they were, what they were doing, and they? Who were they? Exactly. Homily, Pod, and little Harrietty. Pod? Yes, even their names were never quite right. They imagined they had their own names, quite different from human names. But with half an ear you could tell they were borrowed, even Uncle Henry's and Eggltina's. Everything they had was borrowed. They had nothing of their own at all, nothing. In spite of this, my brothers said they were touchy and conceited and thought they owned the world. How do you mean? They thought human beings were just invented to do the dirty work, great slaves put there for them to use. At least that's what they told each other, but my brother said that underneath he thought they were frightened. It was because they were frightened he thought that they'd grown so small. Each generation had become smaller and smaller and more hidden. In the olden days, it seems, and in some parts of England, our ancestors talked quite openly about the little people. Yes, said Kate, I know. Nowadays, I suppose, Mrs. May went on slowly, if they exist at all, you would only find them in houses which are old and quiet and deep in the country, where the human beings live to a routine. Routine is their safeguard. It is important for them to know which rooms need to be used and when. They do not stay long where there are careless people, unruly children, or certain household pets. This particular old house, of course, was ideal, although as far as some of them were concerned, a trifle cold and empty. Great Aunt Sophie was bedridden through a hunting accident some 20 years before. And as for other human beings, there was only Mrs. Driver the cook, Crampfurl the gardener, and at rare intervals an odd housemaid or such. My brother, too, when he went there after rheumatic fever, had to spend long hours in bed, and for those first weeks it seemed the borrowers did not know of his existence. He slept in the old night nursery beyond the schoolroom. The schoolroom at that time was sheeted and shrouded and filled with junk. Old trunks, a broken sewing machine, a desk, a dressmaker's dummy, a table, some chairs, and a disused pianola. As the children who'd used it, Great Aunt Sophie's children, had long since grown up, married, died, or gone away. The night nursery opened out of the schoolroom, and from his bed my brother could see the oil painting of the Battle of Waterloo which hung above the schoolroom fireplace, and on the wall a corner cupboard with glass doors in which was set out on hooks and shelves a doll's tea service, very delicate and old. At night, if the schoolroom door was open, he had a view down the lighted passage which led to the staircase, and it would comfort him to see, each evening at dusk, Mrs. Driver appear at the end of the stairs and across the passage, carrying a tray for Aunt Sophie and Bath Oliver biscuits in the tall, cut-glass decanter of fine, old, pale Madeira. On her way out to Mrs. Driver, she would pause and lower the gas jet in the passage to a dim blue flame, and then he would watch her as she stumped away downstairs, sinking slowly out of sight between the banisters. Under this passage, in the hall below, there was a clock, and through the night he would hear it strike the hours. It was a grandfather clock, and very old. Mr. Frith of Leighton Buzzard came each month to wind it, as his father had come before him, and his great-uncle before that. For 80 years, they said, and to Mr. Frith's certain knowledge, it had not stopped, and as far as anyone could tell, for as many years before that. The great thing was that it must never be moved. It stood against the wainscot, and the stone flags around it had been washed so often that a little platform, my brother said, rose up inside. And under this clock, below the wainscot, there was a hole.